Hello there and welcome to another Bobeats video, and in today's video we are checking out the new AudioFuse 16 rig from Arturia, and to make things a little bit more interesting I'm also comparing it to the other AudioFuse interfaces, for example the classic AudioFuse, the first one that I got, and this one, the AudioFuse Studio, the big brother to the classic one, as well as the 8 Pre. And I hope that today's video can serve as a guide helping you picking the right AudioFuse for your needs. But before we can compare the different AudioFuses, we have to take a look at the new Arturia 16 rig. And full disclosure, Arturia sent over the 16 rig free of charge, but no money changed hands and Arturia doesn't have a say over what I do in my video. And if you want to support in-depth music tech content like this, go over to my Patreon and support me over there. The 16 rig is Arturia's new flagship audio interface. A welcome feature for us who loves hardware is that you can control the internal mixer using a MIDI keyboard or controller. As the name suggests, the 16 rig has 16 inputs, but you can expand them up to 32 inputs over ADAT. And with a MIDI controller attached, you can think of the 16 rig as a sort of a hybrid between a USB mixer and an audio interface, because you can run it totally standalone, without the need of a computer. And if you're wondering what I'm doing here, I'm controlling not just the level of the mini-low that is running into the ADAT expander, which is hooked up to the 16 rig, I'm also controlling the aux send level that sends a stereo signal, or two of them, into external effects and back into an ADAT expander. Next up, let's take a look at the 16 rig's screen and the I/O. On the right side we have an on and off button followed by two USB, and in standalone mode one of these can be used to send MIDI data without a computer. And then we have headphones level control and two outputs that can be used simultaneously. Next up we have the monitor control with a dedicated mute button and an assignable button that you can use, for example, to dim the sound or change between different speaker pairs. Then we have the big encoder, which you use to navigate the menu system. It might seem a little difficult or even crowded at first, but it's a really simple menu system. The screen is something that sets the 16 rig apart from the other AudioFuses, and it basically makes it a much more useful device in standalone mode, so you can basically use it as a mixer without any computer. On the left side of the unit we have quick inputs and outputs. First, two outputs that can also be turned into additional headphone outputs or used for reamping, followed by two XLR combo jacks and a stereo mini jack. Using these inputs and outputs will overwrite whatever is connected on the back of the unit, and it's meant for quickly connecting something, for example a synth that you want to test out. In terms of sound quality, the 16 rig is more focused on line audio than microphones. The microphone preamps are not the same as on the other AudioFuses, and I do notice a little bit of quality difference, but it's not huge. But more importantly, I'm missing that bit of extra gain that you could get out of the other AudioFuses. And next we have a set of quick access buttons that lets you jump to, for example, the settings for inputs or outputs. On the back of the unit we have line inputs 1 to 16 and a pair of dedicated monitor outputs, as well as line outputs 3 to 10. We have power, USB-C for connecting to a computer, and a USB hub port, as well as MIDI in and two outs that can also work as through. For ADAT we have dual in and out, which gives us a total of 16 inputs and outputs up to 48 kHz. There's also word clock, which you might actually need if you intend to hook up dual ADAT expanders, because ADAT number 2 doesn't send clock. And if we take a closer look at the menu system here, most settings are available in standalone mode, and the big exception is of course the matrix used to route sound. For that you need a computer. So we can access the physical inputs and see and change audio levels, engage pad, change phase, link two inputs into a stereo input, for example. And the ability to change settings using the screen is actually a big difference from the other AudioFuses that can be used standalone, but you don't have access to any advanced settings when they're in standalone mode, so you have to set them up preemptively, but on the 16 rig you can actually change it on the fly. We can also access the physical outputs. We can see the monitor outputs, headphones, and the line outputs, and access settings for these. We can also access the main mix and Q mix and alter settings for the mixer. And additionally, we have settings for MIDI, we have general settings and presets, which lets you save and recall different AudioFuse configurations. The 16 rig also has another quite unusual feature, and that is that you can control the internal mixer using a MIDI controller or keyboard. So this here is the ARTURIA Keylab 88, but this will work with whatever controller you have that can send MIDI CC messages. So as you can see on the screen, we are changing the levels here in the mixer view, also changing the master level, and also changing the panning. And if we take a look at the MIDI configurations page, you can see that all of these parameters here are CC assignable. And you can even use MIDI learn, so we can MIDI learn, for example, this one here to this knob here. So now we've assigned this knob here to change the aux level. So if this setup here looks like a bit of a mess, it's because it is. I just did a test here to test stuff out because I'm in the process of building a new home studio. Thumbs up if you want to see a video about that process. So over here is actually the 16 rig, and from the 16 rig I'm running a USB cable which is connected to the Launch Control XL, and the Launch Control XL controls the internal mixer of the 16 rig as well as the ADAT expansions, the 8 pre here and the 8 pre over here. It's not supposed to be over here. But back to the 16 rig, and the 16 rig is connected using ADAT. So we have 4 ADAT cables, 2 for each expander, and then I have the main monitor outputs. I also have word clock going out on a BNC connector, and the word clock is being sent to the first ADAT expander and then pass through to the second one. You can also split using, let me see if I can grab them, using a T-splitter. But I want to mention that if you put a T-splitter here, it sort of gets in the way of the ADAT cables a little bit. It can be a little difficult to get everything fitted in there nicely if you're using the 8 pre's. So instead I'm doing pass-through of word clock because the second ADAT output here doesn't send clock, so you have to clock it from the main device to the second device, then to the third device. And then I have 2 effects here, so I'm taking stereo signals out of the first expander into these effects and then back into the expander again. And then I can use the MIDI controller to set the level using these knobs here of the effect send per track. And here's the control for the track levels. I can also mute and solo using these buttons. And the cool thing is you could do a setup like this here without any ADAT expanders. You could also buy cheaper ADAT expanders to get more inputs and outputs and basically have like a hybrid audio interface mixer setup with a MIDI controller instead of having a USB mixer. But the USB mixer would of course work just as well. And I almost forgot a really important use case that might not be obvious to everyone. You could run a really long USB cable to a MIDI controller and control the levels and the panning and the aux sends from somewhere else in the studio, somewhere that is not where you have your interface set up. And I think that is also something which is interesting because generally, whether it's a mixer or audio interface, it has its fixed position in the studio. So that sort of flexibility is quite nice. Next up, let's take a look at the updated AudioFuse Control Center software. So it might look a little crowded and confusing. Don't worry, we'll go through it and I'll explain the basics of how to use this software. So the first page here, because up here we have different pages that we can go through. So the first page here is your inputs and outputs. Think of them as the physical inputs and outputs on the device itself, plus the loop back that we have here. Loop back is basically system audio. And the physical inputs and outputs are not to be confused with the second screen here, the second little page, which is the main mix. And then we have the Q mix. The main mix or the Q mix is basically what we are hearing, whereas the first page here relates to the physical inputs and how we've set them up. So for example, we can see here, front mic. So I've plugged in a mic in the front XLR port. There's a level control here. You can see I can turn it up and down. There's the pad setting for dampening the sound. There's, I think, phase. And then there's the rear button, which basically forces the AudioFuse to use the rear input instead of the front input. And then we have 48 volts of phantom power, which is only active when you have a mic plugged in here. And if you want to, you can take any 2 channels here and turn them into stereo channels, giving us just one level control here. And on the right side, we have the 16 ADAT inputs. Do note that you can't make any changes to level, for example. You have to do that on the ADAT expansion itself. And then we have the analog outputs. We have the monitor control here with dim, mute, and we can also turn it mono, or we can set up an A/B listening. This is what you use that button on the front of the unit for. So you can basically select what that button does, whether it dims, turns the signal mono, or an A/B. So if you have a second speaker pair, you can set up A/B listening. There's level control for the headphones and different ohm settings, as well as the analog out 3 and 4. These ones are located both on the back and the front. And if you're using the front, you can actually turn it into a stereo signal, so you can link them. And then you can just use alt phones here to turn them into headphones outputs. So you have one level control is basically the same signal sent in stereo to both of the outputs on the front. And then we have the rest of the analog outputs, as well as the loopback and ADAT outputs. And of course, ADAT outputs can't be changed in any way. We only see the levels. Then if we go to the second page here, we get a lot more control. So we have, for example, the ability to change the panning. We also have auxiliary outputs here. So you have aux sends basically, so aux 1 through 4, and you can also link them together like this. You press the plus and minus symbol here to add analog inputs, ADAT inputs, and computer sources so that you can control them using this mixer view here. And then we have the Q mix, which is basically a secondary mix that you can listen to. So you could have, for example, a pair of headphones set up to listen to just the Q mix. The next page is probably the most confusing one. It definitely confused me. I'm not that kind of big-brained audio engineer, so it took a little getting used to. But here we have sources and destinations. So this is your mod matrix where you patch things together. So the top here is basically your sound sources. And then we have destinations. So what I'm doing here, if we check main, is main left and right. So the main mix, left and right mix output that we have over here. So this one is actually, if we go back here, being sent, main left and right, is being sent to monitor left and right. It's being sent to phones, as well as analog out 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. Why 5 and 6? Because I have set up a secondary speaker pair on 5 and 6, and I'm using alt phones, so headphone settings for the 3 and 4 outputs on the front, and then we have normal headphones, and then we'll have just a normal monitor output. So if we go back here to the first one, we can see that monitor, phones, analog out, 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 are all receiving the same signal here. And if I wanted to put a pair of speakers instead of 5 and 6, I wanted to put them on, say, 9 and 10, I could just go like this. Go back here, you can see 9 and 10, and then we can just turn it into a stereo track here. So we have control over level. So as far as I understand the routing matrix, it's not possible to set up very complicated and long chains of audio routings. Instead, it's basically your sound sources sending audio to different outputs. But as you can see, an output like 9 and 10 can't have multiple sources attached to it. So if I try and send, say, analog inputs 1 and 2, or no, sorry, let's do 9 and 10. Let's do 9 and 10, and I want to send them here. Then these outputs here are no longer receiving the main mix sound. So to do more complicated routings, I would do them in my DAW, or I would just do them physically outside of any DAW environment. And the latency performance for being a USB 2.0 interface is actually quite good. As you can see, we are at 32 samples. This is pretty low. So you see 3.9, 3.6. And if I go up to 64, which is usually what I use, I don't run like super big projects on my Mac Studio. So 4.5, 4.3, pretty good. And if we do a buffer size of 128 inside of Cubase, you can see input latency 5.9, output latency 5.6. And I also checked the latency performance inside of Ableton. So 32 samples, you can see, quite similar. It's a bit higher than in Cubase, but not by a lot. 64 samples, 128. So similar results, though a little bit higher. And when I compare the results with AudioFuse Studio running on a much older computer, the latency performance is pretty much the same. Next up, let's do a comparison between all of the AudioFuse audio interfaces. So if you're just starting out, I wouldn't actually get a big AudioFuse interface. They're quite expensive, and you should look at something like Arturia's MiniFuse or similarly priced small interfaces instead. With that being said, the main differences between the different AudioFuse interfaces is the number of inputs, the number of outputs, and the type of inputs and outputs, the type of connectors there are, and also the differences in hands-on control offered on the different devices. And if you want an interface to place on your studio desk, like right in front of you, then I would look at the classic AudioFuse and the AudioFuse Studio. So while you can place the 16 rig and the 8 pre directly on the desk, so these small bracket thingies here can be angled down so you can put it on a desk, they're definitely best suited for being rack mounted. So if we take a look at these two, both of them have a big knob here for master volume, as well as level control for the inputs here and for the headphones. We also have direct monitor controls here. For example, we have a mute button, dim button, and mono button. They also have easy switching between different cue mixes, and you can also have each headphone's output to its own cue mix. So if we take a look here, it's over here, you can see, you can select here between Q1 and Q2. Same here, Q1, Q2 or main mix for the headphones. And you can do the same for the main output. Now the original AudioFuse has this wheel here, which lets you switch between monitoring the computer and the inputs directly. And this is very useful, and I miss this feature on pretty much all other AudioFuses. Now when we are talking I/O, these two are fairly similar, it's just a difference in numbers. So we have XLR inputs here, combo jacks, 4 on the Studio, 2 on the Classic, and then we have headphones outputs, same. And then on the back, we have 2 line inputs on the Classic and 4 line inputs on the Studio. And on the back, we also have SPDIF inputs and outputs, and this is only available on these 2 units, not the 8 pre or 16 rig. So this means 2 additional inputs and outputs. It's a digital connector, even though it looks a little bit like an RCA. And speaking of RCA, we have the phono inputs over here. They are using 3 and 4 here, so these 2, and these 2 here as well, 5 and 6. So it's not dedicated inputs using the phono or RCA jacks here, but it's still here. It's also something that is unique to the Studio and the Classic. They are not available. If we take a look here on the back, on the 8 pre, for example, there is no phono on that one, no RCA connectors. Now going back to the back of the unit again, we can see that the Studio has 4 inserts, whereas the Classic one only has 2. Now an insert is something often found on mixers, and what it does is it lets you send the audio from one of your inputs, so you connect something in here like a mic for example, to an insert effect like a compressor, and then back again into the interface using just one cable and one of these jacks. So you need a cable that splits into ring and tip. So that's just useful in certain situations, and it's something that I'm missing on the newer 16 rig, which doesn't have this. But the 8 pre does have insert, send and return on 2 channels. Now in terms of outputs, the original has 4 outputs, whereas the Studio has 6 here on the unit. 2 of them are called aux and can be used for reamping, but they're just basically standard outputs. And then we have 2 pairs, 2 stereo pairs here used for speakers A and B, but you could of course assign them to something else. And it's the same here, that we have speakers A and speaker B, but you could use these outputs for something else. Now talking expandability, both can be expanded with 8 additional inputs and outputs over ADAT, so we can see that here. But the Studio has dual ADAT, just like the 16 rig, so you might be thinking, oh, I can use 2 expanders to get 16 additional inputs here. But you can't. It only supports up to 8 additional channels, but it has dual ADAT, meaning that it can support up to 8 additional channels at 96 kilohertz, which this little one can't. So this is similar to the new 16 rig that can do 16 channels over ADAT at 48 kilohertz or 8 channels at 96 kilohertz. Note, however, this is super important, that the 8 channels at 96 kilohertz requires an ADAT expander like the Arturia 8 pre, which also has dual ADAT I/O, so it's dual ADAT over here. So you can't just use any cheaper ADAT expander with just one input output and expect to get 8 channels at 96 kilohertz with the Studio or with the 8 pre or with the newer 16 rig. It requires a more expensive expander if you want that high resolution audio over ADAT. Now back to the back of the unit again, and unlike the 16 rig, which has full-sized MIDI in and 2 outs, this one has MIDI in and out on these TRS mini TRS jacks, and they do come with their own adapters for that. And both have a USB hub with 3 USB ports that can be used, for example, to power, say, a MIDI keyboard or controller. You can see over here. So we have 3 ones here, 3 ones here. Now the 8 Pre, on the other hand, doesn't support any sort of MIDI connectivity whatsoever, and this can actually be a little bit annoying if you're running a lot of synths, because then you need a MIDI interface in addition to just your audio interface. So that's something you might want to think about. Now all 3 of these devices offer that extra gain. If you hold down the pad button, it turns red, and it gives just a little bit of extra boost, extra gain to the mic inputs, and that's really useful for using demanding mics like my Rode Procaster or SM7B, for example, especially when you're live streaming or doing podcasts, when you might not have like that any way to add additional gain. It depends on your setup, of course, but yeah, I really like that extra boost that you can get out of these 3 units, but you can't get that out of the 16 rig. Now the Studio, if we just take a look at this one, has some extra bells and whistles. For example, you have this button here you can click to turn on Bluetooth, so you can send audio over Bluetooth to it, and it's actually quite useful. It also has a talkback microphone, and the Studio has something that the Classic does not. It has loopback audio, so a dedicated way of recording system audio. Now let's push these to the side and just talk a little bit about the 8 Pre, because it's pretty much in its own category. It's both an ADAT expander with dual ADAT ports, making it possible to do 8 channels in 96 kHz over ADAT, and it's also an audio interface. So all expanders for ADAT are not audio interfaces, but this one lacks a lot of the impressive I/O features of the original AudioFuse and the Studio, as well as the 16 rig. And I think it's best viewed as an ADAT expander or as an interface for a more classic recording studio, because the 8 input channels have direct level control, as you can see here on the front, which is really handy in like certain recording situations. So it has basic monitoring control here, for example. You have a mono button, you have Q-mix button, and you also have the quick inputs here on the front. So that's very nice. And the 8 inputs here are all mic inputs. That's also a reason why it's a really good expander or interface for a recording studio, where you might need more mic inputs for recording, say, a drum set or, you know, an entire band. And the mic preamps, I think, are the same on all units. They do sound the same anyway, to me, seems the same, and they do sound really good. And all of the mic inputs on the 8 Pre can be phantom powered. So if you need a lot of mic inputs, the 8 Pre is the way to go. So talking mic inputs, 4 mic inputs here, 2 mic inputs. Here we have 8 mic inputs, and on the 16 rig, I do believe it's only 2 mic inputs. And to make sure you don't miss it, the mic preamps on the 16 rig are not the same as on the other ones. If you want the best mic preamps, go for something else other than the 16 rig. So how does the 16 rig compare to these interfaces then? Well, it's Arturia's most feature-packed interface in terms of raw inputs and outputs. So 16 natively, 32 with ADAT expanders, dual ADAT expanders, and it also has real DIN MIDI ports. It has USB for MIDI, which is also really great when you're using it standalone. It has the best standalone operation of any of these devices by quite a stretch. It has a display, which is unique compared to these, and it has more quick connections on the front than any of these ones do, compared to, for example, the 8 Pre, which only has the 2 mic input or combo jacks here. But there's no RCA, no SPDIF, no insert jacks, and most importantly, a less hands-on design, relying more on the screen and less on having like physical knobs and buttons to press, which some of us really like. And on the software side, the 16 rig has a lot more to offer because you have a lot more routing possibilities than on these devices. I don't think that there's that much to complain about with the 16 rig. It works pretty much as advertised, but I do have a couple of potential issues that I want to share. So firstly, the lack of additional gain or boost on the mic preamp compared to the other audio fuses was something that I was constantly missing. Especially when I'm live streaming or doing video calls, I love having that extra bit of gain that I could get out of the other audio fuses because it let me set the level exactly where I want it when I'm using a more demanding dynamic microphone. Some mics just require that bit of extra gain, and I love that on the other audio fuses. Another thing that I noticed was that the XLR connector offered much more resistance when removing an XLR cable from the 16 rig compared to the classic ones here and the 8 Pre. They had much less resistance when I was removing the cable. And from what I understand, the connectors should be the same or very similar, but it just feels different. And while I was testing using a MIDI controller to control the internal mixer, I noticed a bug or potential issue. When you set up the MIDI controller, you set it up to control 8 channels, but you can also assign buttons to switch between 1 through 8 and then 9 through 16, for example, and all the way up to 32 channels with the ADAT channels that you can add. But if you have channels set to stereo, it messes it up. So suddenly I don't have control over all of the ADAT channels reliably. And I'm not sure if it's a bug, if it's intended, and if it's intended, it's something that needs to be fixed and made much more clear to the user, because it is very difficult to understand why suddenly it's jumping from, say, 1 through 16 and then to, say, 25, 26, 27, so on. Like it jumps over a segment of the channels. The latency performance is what I would expect from a USB 2.0 interface, but obviously there are interfaces with a lot better latency. But on the plus side, it means that this interface is compatible with pretty much any computer because USB 2 basically works with anything nowadays. Another thing to be mindful of is that there's no DSP. But it does come with a suite of software that you can use, but no onboard DSP power. And none of these audio fuses have any DSP. So if that's something you want, you have to look elsewhere for that. While I personally never used it much, I can see that some people might miss the insert jacks of the other audio fuses. Oh, and another thing I've been missing since the first audio fuse is this little knob rotary encoder here that lets you set whether or not you're listening to the direct input, like the live sound or the computer sound, or a mix between. I'm really missing that on pretty much all of the other audio fuses, really. I also want to mention the software. So while I think that the software is fine, there is also something with the design that bothers me. I think it's the lack of colors, and the channels are blending together in a weird way, especially in the mixer section. I would have liked to see just a little bit more color there. The aux sends could be different color. There could be some color variation between the tracks, just so it doesn't all blend together. But other than these complaints, some of which are very personal complaints, I had very little problems with the 16 rig in practice, and the same goes for all of the Arturia interfaces. I've been mainly using Arturia interfaces now since the first audio fuse, the classic one. I don't have the Rev 2. This is the original one with the crappy little micro USB here on the back. But even though I don't like the micro USB on this one, I still very much stand behind this lineup of audio interfaces. They're very good. They feel really good to work with, and they sound really good, especially the mic preamps sound really good on all of these devices. And yeah, overall, I'm just a very happy audio fuse user. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. I hope you found it entertaining and informative. And if you have questions, drop them down below. See you in the next video.